All right. It looks like we have about 111 people joining us this morning so far, and we're probably growing. Welcome, everyone. I'm Steve Duble, Harris County Democratic Lawyers. We have a special program today with Dr. Ray Perryman, and Barbara Radnowski is going to moderate that for us. But before we get to that, a couple of announcements. Tentatively, we have scheduled a program on the first Thursday of February at noon with Jay Malone, the political director of the AFL-CIO here. Also, if you didn't know it, we have early voting starting very soon, February 14th. So we all got a lot of work to do. Today, we have joining us the executive director of Blue Action Democrats, Lana Hansen. And she's going to visit with us for a few minutes about the great work that they're doing across the state. Lana, go ahead.
Thank you. I appreciate being here today. As Steve said, I'm Lana Hansen. I'm the executive director of Texas Blue Action Democrats, and I couldn't be more thrilled to be here and share with you about the importance of the work that we're doing. Blue Action Democrats has been building neighborhood year-round organizing infrastructure for the past 4 years. We were born in a neighborhood in Southwest Austin out of the angst of being written off as being red because that had been how the voting patterns had been for 20 years. And our founder knew that there were other voters like her out there and decided to organize 9 precincts doing old school neighbor to neighbor community organizing. And what happened in 2018 in those 9 precincts ended up being the highest Democratic voter turnout in the state of Texas and flipped 2 local seats that have been red for 20 years. And that was a city council seat and Vicki Goodwin's House seat. Since then, in 2020, we grew to 256 precincts covering most of Austin and San Antonio. And what we found when the data came back in 2020 after that election was that our organizing efforts turned out more Democratic voters. It increased Democratic voters by 3 to 10% in every single precinct that we organized. We have since grown from 9 precincts. Now we're covering 953 precincts, organizing in neighborhoods from Williamson County, which is north of Austin, all the way down through Southwest Houston. By using local leaders in the communities to build the infrastructure that is sustainable, we're supporting Democrats up and down the ballot because they do not have to start over every year. We've already identified the voters and cleaned up the voter information that is in the VAN database to support these candidates as they run. They already know who the voters are that they need to talk to and inspire to turn out. We've had tremendous success with the down ballot races, from school boards to city councils to judges and to House seats. And that is because when we're doing neighbor to neighbor organizing and talking to people about the policies that matter to them in their neighborhoods, it's inspiring them to turn out every single election, not just in election years. And they turn out as educated voters that are voting from the top of the ticket to the bottom of the ticket. We're extremely data focused. And one of the things that we've identified that's particularly important for us right now with the primary coming up is just in the precincts that we're organizing alone, we have 450,000 new voters that we can bring to the table for the primary. And we start targeting them this weekend by canvassing from now and through March 1st. As you can see, that building this kind of infrastructure takes a lot of resources, but we're going to have a massive impact on what we're doing in 2020 because we have proven that we're able to turn out the voters we need and we get them to vote all the way down the ballot, which is massively important in changing the political structure in Texas. And so we will, continue this work, but the farther and the faster we can grow it, the greater impact we'll have in a shorter amount of time. And so I hope you will all consider reaching out and talking to me further about the work that we're doing. And I hope you'll all consider making an investment in the work that we're doing. Building this type of sustainable long-term infrastructure that's in play year after year takes a lot of resources, not just in time, but also financial. I'll drop all of the information in the chat about how to reach me and how to get in touch. And again, I want to thank you all for having me here today.
Lana, thanks for being here and thanks for everything that you do. And we're here to support you, and we look forward to partnering with you on lots of things in this.
Fantastic. I look forward to it too. Thanks again.
Right. And we also have joining us this morning, Nicholas Spencer, the president of Texas Democratic Lawyers Association, and he is going to introduce our featured candidates for the Court of Appeals today. Nicholas, good morning.
Good morning, Steve, and this is a fantastic event. So thank you very much for the work that HCDLA is doing, and we are delighted to partner with HCDLA to ensure that events like this go forward. Today we have two candidates for the 14th Court of Appeals, Place 9, who are both accomplished attorneys who are going to talk to us for a few moments about their campaigns and the work that they intend to do on the 14th Court of Appeals. First, we have William DeMond, and then second, we will have Chris Conrad, who will be able to discuss that as well. William, would you like to go first?
Happy to. Thank you. My name is William DeMond. I am a constitutional rights attorney, and I'm running for the Texas Court of Appeals, Place 9. That's the 14th Court of Appeals here in Houston. I've had the privilege of litigating constitutional rights on behalf of Texans for the last 10 years, usually in federal courts. And having watched that happen, I've seen the change that's happened in our federal courts. And I sincerely believe that the best place for us to protect our constitutional rights is in our intermediate state courts of appeals. I am looking to contribute to the makeup of the 14th Court of Appeals. I think that when we're looking at our candidates for our courts, we need to see who is going to benefit those courts the best. And as a constitutional rights attorney, I believe that I can do that. I've been honored as one of only 3 constitutional rights super lawyers in the state of Texas. I've been honored by the Texas Civil Rights Project with a pro bono award for defending civil rights in Texas. This is my path. This is my passion. This is what I do. I sincerely appreciate all the work that HCDLA has been doing and in making sure that we get quality candidates elected. And I sincerely appreciate the support. Again, my name is William DeMond, and I'm a constitutional rights attorney running as a Democrat for the 14th Court of Appeals, Place 9. Thank you.
Thank you, William. Chris?
Yes, thank you so much. My name is Chris Conrad. I'm running for the same position, the 14th Court of Appeals, Place 9. A little bit about myself. I'm graduated from Rice University and attended UT Law School. For the past 15 years, I've worked as a lawyer. I first started out as a trial attorney. I've also had some civil experience in the bond division at the DA's office, as well as working in the juvenile, misdemeanor, and felony division. For the past 6 years, I've worked exclusively as an appellate attorney. During that time, I filed over 100 briefs and argued in front of both the 1st and the 14th Court of Appeals on multiple occasions, as well as filed PDRs, the Texas Court of Appeals. The reason I'm running is because I handed a case about 2 years ago that really showed me a pattern of defendants, indigent defendants, not being treated the same as other defendants who are more well off. In that case, it was a well-connected defendant whose father was actually a judge who was given a new punishment hearing when I've handled other cases where defendants in the exact same situation, the error was found to be harmless. And that opened my eyes to the danger of having a 2-tiered justice system, one in which corporations and the wealthy have more rights than the indigent and workers. And I want to make sure that all litigants and all defendants are treated fairly and accorded the same rights. Again, my name is Chris Conrad, and I'd appreciate your support for the 14th Court of Appeals, Place 9. Thank you.
And if we could ask William and Chris to put the contact information for their campaign into the chat so that everyone has access to that and could support their campaigns. And we'd also call to everyone's attention the fact that the primary is for March 1st. So I assume anybody on this call is already registered to vote, but if not, please get about that as urgently as possible. Steve, can I turn it back over to you?
You can. Thank you, Nicholas. And thank you, candidates and Lena. So one other quick announcement. If you have not renewed your dues for Harris County Democratic Lawyers Association, they are only $75 a year, and you can do it on our website. It's our acronym. And also, Nicholas, I think you can, y'all aren't collecting dues yet, but you can join Texas Democratic Lawyers if you're outside of Harris County and are interested in helping with all the work we're doing and the voter protection work we're going to be doing in this next election cycle. You can go to the Texas Democratic Lawyers Association Facebook page, and there'll be sign-up links there. And I wanted to thank Rose Clouston from the Texas Democratic Party for helping us with today's event. We have a record attendance of about 150 people joining us today, which I hope that is an indicator of the excitement for this upcoming election and an indicator of turnout and interest in the election. Now I'm going to turn it over to our good friend Barbara Radnowski, who's going to moderate today's discussion with Dr. Perryman. Barbara, take it over.
Thank you very much. Hello, folks. Let me jump right in, because the speech we have today is by someone who's going to present what we need to know that really culminates, really is the culmination of what we've been presenting to you for the last several years. I've worked with 3 geniuses in my 43-year law career, and one of them won the Nobel Prize for Medicine. Another one is a brilliant writer and author, and Ray Perryman is the other. It would take too long to tell you about his accomplishments in the genius category. He's won so many awards, and I'm glad we were able to spread to you his background. He's got the most widely used primer on economic development in the entire United States, according to the Economic Development Council, who granted Dr. Perryman their Lifetime Achievement Award. His program, which is called Texas Our Texas, which is a comprehensive plan for the state's economic development, made him, in the words of the award, instrumental in the creation of hundreds of thousands of jobs and trillions of dollars in capital investments. He is, he's got many accolades, and the most important, I think, would be not the ones that Business Week gave him as a world-class scholar or a genius, which I found out when I was researching him for this introduction, by the Wall Street Journal, the state's preeminent economist by the Dallas Morning News. But really, what's the most important point, and he and I have, he thinks I'm joking about it, he's a humanitarian, and he has used his work for good. And I've told him we should nominate him for best human in the world, and he laughed at me. And then when I went through the data or the information, he was named Outstanding Young Person of the World for Business and Economic Innovation in 1987. He's in the Texas Leadership Hall of Fame. He received the Cesar Chavez Conscience Builder Award. He was named the most dynamic economic research in the US by Global Business Insights. But the most important thing is that Dr. Perryman devotes a huge amount of his time to pro bono work aimed at helping to solve pressing social problems such as hunger, indigent healthcare, poverty, and child mistreatment. I've known him for decades. I want you guys to hear what Ray Perryman has to say on a variety of issues, but they all have a common theme. And our title for this presentation is only a small aspect of the business case. There's a grander case for saving democracy. Ray, would you have at it? And if we interrupt you with questions, it's because Steve and I want to make sure we all understand what you've got to say.
Thanks, Barbara. No pressure or anything.
Right.
I appreciate the introduction very much. Barbara, as we all know, has been a great public servant here in Texas for decades, and a great attorney as well. And it's always a pleasure to have an opportunity to interact with her. And I'm very pleased to be here and be with you today. I don't come at this like the rest of you as a member of the Democratic Party. I come at it as an analyst who pursues information and reaches conclusions. And remarkably, those conclusions often tend to align with those of your party, and particularly on a lot of very crucial issues that we're about today. And I want to try to weave a lot of things into this. The topic I was given was the business case for more Texans and more Texas voters. But I'm going to weave a lot of other things in that are all related to that. And I'm going to do my best to do that as concisely as I can. I'm not particularly good at that, but I will try to be as concise as I can. And we'll try to offer you some insights that are worthwhile. I understand you've heard from in the past from Professor Bobbitt about his view of things moving from into market states and that sort of thing. I view markets as a remarkable human invention that we have received a lot of benefit from, but also one that has a few very important flaws. And if you don't address those flaws, you can get some very bad outcomes. And I think our biggest failures in recent years have been that we haven't addressed those in the way that we should have. And I'll touch on that briefly. That's a whole entire different topic if you want to invite me back sometime. But let me plunge right into this one and talk first about more Texans, because if you've been looking at the census numbers, it's pretty obvious we have more Texans. The town I grew up in at the time I lived there had about 1,000 people. We add about that many people to Texas every day, and we have been doing that for decades. So that's, given that my little town was totally functional and kind of a nice place to be, that's hard to wrap your arms around, that we make a new one every day, but in essence we do. And you get down to it, and that comes down to basically demographic patterns. And those, for all the complexity that we can make into it, boil down to a couple of things. How many people are born, how many people are die, and where do they move around in between? And that's what really drives a lot of this. And in Texas, we have two issues with regard to population growth. That's our birth rates and our migration rates. And I would emphasize for that, I'm going to focus on both of them to some extent as I go along here. But from a state's perspective, migration means not only people who come from other countries, but people who come from other states. And if you want to attract those people, there are certain things you need to do as a state in order to be able to do that successfully. And as Barbara mentioned, I've written a lot of stuff about how to attract things to states over the years. But starting with the notion of more Texans, the very good news is that we do have more Texans. And we've heard a lot in the last few months, particularly during the pandemic, about a workforce shortage in this country, how critical it is. We now have over 10,000 job openings in the country. What people fail to tell you with all that is we had over 8,000 when the pandemic started. I'm sorry, over 8 million when the pandemic started. We've only added 2 million as a result of the pandemic. Most of this was with us before. It's going to be with us after, because fundamentally what we have is lower birth rates. We have people entering the workforce later. We have more people retiring earlier, a lot of things like that going on, and a downward trend in the number of people who participate in the workforce. And that's been going on for a very long time. And the pandemic kind of put an exclamation point on some of it, but it didn't really fundamentally change a lot of what was going on before, and we're going to continue to see that going forward. And what that says is any place that can provide, in terms of the business case that I was asked to talk about, any place that can provide a pool of skilled, available workers is going to have a huge decided business advantage going forward. Now, as I mentioned, here in Texas, we are blessed to have a growing population. That's not universally true. If you look at the numbers from the last census, I don't want to dwell on a lot of numbers, but a couple of things hit me. Number one, if you look at the number of people under the age of 18, the workforce of the future, if you look at the number of people under 18, the country had 1 million fewer people in that category in 2020 than we had in 2010. We lost 1 million young people in the United States. We had 440,000 more in Texas. So another way to say that is the rest of the country was down about 1.5 million, and we made up a third of it, is one way to look at it. The other way is we have the raw material to have and make that business case. To do that, we have to make sure those folks are well educated. We have to make sure that we deal with the social issues that confront them, the rights issues that confront them, and everything else. And I'm going to, again, dwell on this some. I don't want to hit you with a whole lot of numbers today, but I probably will. It's my nature. I can't help it. But let me just start with a few here. One of the more interesting things that came out in the census as well was this time 39.7% of the Texas population was Anglo. 39.7%. 39.3% was Hispanic. So they were basically equal. But if you look at how those lines have been crossing in recent years, that census was completed the middle of last year. They've already crossed. Today, there are more Hispanics in Texas than Anglos. And we've been a majority minority state for a long time. And that has some wonderful, outstanding advantages to it. But it also brings some challenges because of a long history of a lack of opportunity, discrimination, a lack of engagement in the workforce, a lot of other things, educational opportunities. And that's the kind of thing we have to address. And so let me kind of plunge in with a few numbers here to set the stage. Because the Hispanic population is younger, although it's roughly 40% of our population, it's about 53% of our school enrollment in Texas is Hispanic. The households from which those young people come, those 53% of the young people in Texas, have about 5.7% of the household wealth in Texas. So you have 50% of the kids and 5% of the money is another way to say it. The Black population has been relatively stable over the years, changing just a little bit. About 12% of our school enrollment is Black. Those households have about 2% of the money. So when you put all that together, what you find is roughly 2/3 of our kids in households that have roughly 8% of the money. And so as a result of that, that's a big imbalance. And to go even a step further, if you look at the Anglo population, because again, we're an aging population, we actually have about 180,000 fewer Anglos in our schools than we had 10 years ago. The but is we have 55,000 more Anglos that are classified as economically disadvantaged. Of the school enrollment that we've had in the last 10 years, 86% of those kids are economically disadvantaged. Now, what that says to us is, very simply, is in the absence of taking care of some of these market failures, that if I were putting it in the economic context, when a student falls behind, they're not going to have a tutor. They're not going to have the enrichment programs. They're not going to have the computer softwares that a more affluent child might have, the opportunities to overcome. It makes it more difficult to move forward. And so that's one aspect of it that I think is very important. 20% of the kids in our public schools have a language barrier. If you walk in 2 classrooms at random in a Texas public schools today, 1 kid is homeless on average. And so, I mean, we're facing some very, very severe issues in terms of our social safety net, our education program, and that sort of thing we need to deal with. And one other thing about that that's interesting, all of those numbers were done just before COVID. Now, we've had 2 years of really interrupted, difficult school. And we know there's a lot of statistics from TEA about how many months people have fallen behind and that sort of thing. But let me give you one that was most disturbing to me. 11% of the school age kids in Texas had no contact with school last year. 11% had no contact whatsoever with school. And so we have a gap to make up in addition to the challenges we were already facing. And so, I mean, I put all that out there just to say we have some huge challenges here that you have to deal with education and educational reform and educational funding, but also in some of the safety net issues. A lot of the kids are hungry. A lot of schools have backpack programs where they send the kids home on Friday afternoon with a backpack full of food because otherwise their family won't eat over the weekend. I mean, a lot of kids get their 1 meal a day from the schools or 2 meals a day in some cases from the schools. There's some very, very real issues here that need to be addressed. Let me add a couple more statistics to that. And then I'll kind of move on to something else, okay? Couple more statistics. One of them is something the Census Bureau does every couple of years that I always find fascinating. They look at the percentage of the people who are raised in a state who end up in that state. And it's probably not surprising to many of you, Texas is number 1 in that list perennially. And it's roughly 78%, almost 80%. So roughly 4 out of every 5 kids that we educate in Texas is going to be in the Texas workforce in the future. Now, what that tells us is basically the kids we have in school today are the kids that are going to be a big, huge part of our economic future here in Texas. Yes, we'll get people from the outside. We've done that since we were a republic, but a big part of it's going to be this particular group. Now, let me give you a statistic from some of my weird modeling stuff that I do, and I promise not to do too many of those as well. But I ran an experiment a couple of years ago, just for grins, just to see what the answer would be, because I could. And the question I asked was, let's suppose the entire education system of Texas, not only public schools, private schools, universities, professional schools, medical schools, law schools, everything else, let's suppose they all stay at exactly the same quality level they are today. Let's assume they graduate the same number of people they graduate, or the same percentage of people they graduate today, with the same levels of achievement today. And I added one caveat, by ethnic group. And then I just let demographics do what demographics is doing. If you look at that, if we don't intervene in about 15 years, not a long time from now, taking out inflation and all that stuff, the average income, not per household, but per person in Texas is going to be $6,000 less than it is today. That should be pretty sobering, because if you're trying to look at a business case, what that says is we're no longer going to be a state that has a lot of high quality workers here that we've trained here in our great university systems and elsewhere here in Texas. We're not going to have those kids here. Instead, we're going to have more kids who are in more need of the services, more adults in more need of the services of a social safety net. And so in essence, you become a high needs, lower economic growth state, which is a place that we know some other places are right now, and we've been very fortunate to avoid that today, and a place I don't think we want to go. So all that to say, there is a business case for investing in education, investing in hunger, investing in the infrastructure, broadband, for example. And I mentioned markets and a lot of things they do. One thing markets can't do is they can't capture value that's not reflected in a market price of something. And when you look at education, the social benefits to education exceed the private benefits. So in the absence of public interference and public provision of schools, education is going to be underfunded.
Ray, can I ask a question that's appeared in the Zoom for reference? It's about private schools and how the richest of households are able to escape from less than properly funded and good public schools. And so there is a drain to private schools. How does this impact on things? And I know I'm rushing things, but talk about solutions and how that information gets out and what solutions would also be there.
Sure. I'll do the best I can on all of that. Certainly that's one phenomenon. One reason, as I mentioned, about 60% of the kids in Texas schools now are economically disadvantaged, but 86% of the growth in the last 10 years has been economically disadvantaged. What that tells us is we're turning our public schools into kind of a repository for economically disadvantaged folks while other folks move somewhere else. And that's what these numbers are basically telling us from that perspective. Some of the voucher programs and you know, vouchers have a long history and done properly in a properly funded public school system, huge caveat, they can do some good things. They can create some innovation and that sort of thing. But in essence, what they've become in the way they've been implemented to date is they've allowed the upper middle class to do what the upper middle class used to be able to do. I mean, that's in effect been what we've had there, which has led to more challenges in the public schools. We saw a huge issue recently, and I'm going a little bit off subject, Barbara, but I'm coming back, I promise, with broadband access during the pandemic. Obviously, the more affluent kids had access to broadband, the more affluent schools had access to broadband, and many others did not. It was a real challenge, and why so many kids were left out of the system completely. And broadband's another example of what I was talking about with the market. It's fundamentally public infrastructure, and the market will do a fine job. We'll get all the broadband we need in places that have two characteristics: population density and affluent people. If you have a lot of people there to support the infrastructure and they can all afford to buy it, we'll have all we want in those places. But when you get to inner cities, you get to rural areas, you get to places where you have either less population density and or less resources to purchase it, then that's where it's going to take some public effort. I know there's been some effort in that direction this year. When I was on the task force for trying to do something with COVID, I wrote a whole bunch of stuff about everything we should do, and the only thing they left in was 2 pages on broadband. So there are some efforts going in that direction, but you know, those kinds of things are very important, and those investments. And again, it's the investment in education. And where I can't answer your question, Barbara, is I am not an expert in how we do education. There are other
right, and before, without getting into the details of how you'd improve education, we've had several speakers who have talked about the need to, Ms. Kellerman from Harvard Kennedy School and some other speakers said that the way to influence is to use data to persuade businesses that it is in their financial interest for future workers, for the very base that you were talking about that is not going to grow unless things change in Texas in education, that in order to for businesses to thrive, there must be a core of well-educated workers. They can't rely on everybody who's well-educated to zoom it in. That there will be some need for the physical presence in Texas for a well-educated, happy workforce.
And there's no question about that. And part of our ongoing efforts, part of the thing I mentioned about the average income going down $6,000 a person is precisely the type of message we're trying to get out there. Another one is if you look at our growing Hispanic population, 75% of the kids in that population that want to pursue ongoing education, be it a certification, college degree, whatever, 75% of those kids at some point have to interrupt their school because of family financial situations. And those are the kinds of things that we have to, as a community, come in and take care of. And again, the market doesn't provide the mechanism to do that. It's going to take some enlightened self-interest on the part of the private sector, as well as some investment by the public sector to get those things done. I'm going to say more about that as I delve into immigration and other topics as well. But let me briefly, I wasn't even planning on talking about this, but let me briefly mention something about the whole thing about zooming it in. The truth of the matter is most companies want people to work in person. And we're moving back in that direction very rapidly. If you listen to the national news, you might think nobody's ever going to work at an office again. But the truth of the matter is, at the peak of the pandemic, 35% of us were working remotely. That number is now 13%. It was 6% before the pandemic ever started. So we have, it's not like everybody's leaving the office forever. That number is 13% and dropping. It was 6% before the pandemic. So again, yes, it's had an impact, but no, it hasn't fundamentally altered the need to have people in a place. I mean, I wish today, we started out hoping to have a bunch of us in the same room today, and we weren't able to make that happen. Things are better when you're there. I would like people to see everyone's faces and see how they're reacting to what I'm saying and that sort of thing. And probably a lot of you saying, hurry up, Ray, hurry up, Ray. but I would like to know that, you know, and see where we go with that. Let me now shift gears, if I can, to that other half of that equation and of how we get our growth. One is population. Again, we have the birth rates are a blessing to Texas. They're the raw material for a great future. If we don't make the proper investments, they'll have exactly the opposite effect. Let me now turn quickly to the immigration topic, which I know is not controversial at all. We've been doing work on this area for a very, very long time. Did a major study on undocumented workers for the Ford Foundation for Texas 5 or 6 years ago that had some impact. But let me kind of just, again, drill down on some numbers for a moment here. First of all, for all the criticism of the foreign-born population that we hear these days, 25% of our workforce in Texas is not born in the United States. And an even larger percentage was not born in Texas, but 30% or 25% was not born in Texas. And the first thing you normally hear about that is, well, it's probably those undocumented folks, and they're part of it. But the bottom line is, walk into any hospital in the state of Texas and see where the doctors are from and see where the healthcare professionals are from. And particularly if you go to a smaller city, mid-sized city, rural area, and look at those hospitals, but 25% of the physicians in Texas were not born in the United States. 23% or so of the healthcare professionals in Texas were not born in the United States. So it's not just a, go into one of the tech companies and talk to our engineers. You know, over 20% of our engineers and scientists who work in Texas were not born in the United States. So it is, yes, it's the undocumented population. I want to say something about that in just a moment too, but it's the entire workforce. We are critically dependent. Again, we are simply not producing people in this country as rapidly as we're going to need those people in the future. And some people talk about automation and how that's going to displace all the workers. What automation does is it changes the nature of the job. And that puts a huge pressure on us to adequately fund job retraining and ongoing education and that sort of thing. But it doesn't really change the number of jobs. And if you stop and think about it, we have the most people working than any point in history in the world, and we have the most technology of any point in history. The wheel, when it was invented, displaced 75% of the existing workforce. But look what it's done to create more jobs in the future. Technology doesn't destroy jobs, it changes jobs, which adds to the pressure we have on our education system. And the one comment I could make about that in terms of not knowing much about educational theory is education systems, I know you've had a very good lecture about this, were designed during the Industrial Revolution. They emerged even earlier to some extent, even going back to some of the unfortunate things in our past. But they were designed as a factory system where you basically, education has always been an assembly line. You put them in kindergarten to the first grade, put something on them, move them down the road, put something on them, move them to the next grade, put something on them, test them every once in a while to make sure they got it all, and then send them on their way.
We've got some specific questions on public services and education. So
okay, let me finish this one sentence.
Yeah. So finish it up and then let me derail you for a little bit because we got lots of questions. Okay,
let's stop. Let me just finish that. What we need today is we need people who can be microprocessors, who can learn and relearn and relearn. And that's really not what historically we try to do in education. That's the big shift that needs to take place. And technology will be a part of that. A lot of things will be a part of it. But that's the big shift in paradigm. And with all of Texas needs and our Texas demographics, we should be in the top 2 or 3 in the country in education funding. I think the last numbers I saw, we were 41st. So we have a long way to go in that regard. Okay, Barbara.
Well, let's first start with Murray's question. Murray Cohen says, assume, as the title says, that we'll lose 30 billion by 2025 with voter suppression continuing. Wouldn't most Republicans think that it's a bargain to retain local control of the state, especially since a large part of the money cost is lost to Democrats? And I know that sounds like a Democrat-Republican question, but keep in mind that it dovetails with what a newspaperman, an old newspaperman who is on this, I see his name, and he asks a related question. And that is, how do we pry the business community away from the urge to privatize these public services and avoid taxes? He says that's the barrier to that's the barrier to improving education. And the questions have some relation in terms of the motivations of what we call Republicans and what you might call private business interests, but not trying to make you be an advocate either way in terms of being a Democrat or a Republican. I know you're strictly neutral, but the concern here is how can we, what are the arguments to be made, and how can you persuade those in power right now not to thoroughly enjoy, either as business or as politicians, what is happening to the people who are being so disadvantaged?
Well, again, I think it's a massive education effort that we have to make on the part of the population as a whole. And one of the things I often say with a lot of my work on hunger and child maltreatment and that sort of thing, a lot of what I'm doing is trying to get people to do the right thing for the wrong reason. You shouldn't have to do an economic study to justify feeding hungry people. But if that's what it takes to get some people to do it, that's what we try to do. We try to make that case, and it's in their economic interest. And literally, and the pandemic's helped us with this some, and ESG movements helped us some. Literally, their sustainability interest to do these things. It's an uphill battle, and as I mentioned, the thing you have is fundamentally the social benefits of education exceed the private benefits. So anytime you privatize it, you're going to underproduce it. I mean,
how do we get the message out? And what businesses?
I mean, if they'd read their Principles of Economics book, they should know that. I mean, it's amazing to me.
But how do we get the message out? And can you name names? Can you tell us businesses, good businesses? I'm not asking you to name, to slam people unless you're willing to, but I'm asking you to name names of the good businesses. For example, the ones that just were named today as continuing to avoid donating on a national scale to those politicians who encourage the 1-6 insurrection. That's an example of businesses who say this is the wrong thing, destroying democracy. I'm asking you within Texas, who are the good businesses that should be encouraged, and that we have a brilliant organizer at the top of the screen in Lana. How can we make an effect by educating people on which businesses are engaging in these long-term rational practices?
Well, again, I don't want to name a lot of names. One that always comes to mind for me, and I will confess, I know the family fairly well, but the HEB Corporation has been a very good corporate citizen for many, many years. I would, if I was going to pick out one company and call them out, it would probably be that one. But there are many others. I mean, for example, right there in Houston, my good friend Paul Yetter's law firm has done some wonderful work on the foster care system, and I think y'all had a program about that. I mean, it's there's a lot of companies doing good things and doing the right thing. I think the critical issue here, though, is not so much that. And again, that's important. We need to highlight it. The point is to make them recognize, as I say, the right thing for the wrong reason, that it's in their economic interest to do these things, their long-term sustainability. And I think one thing the pandemic may have helped us a little bit with is it helped us to understand the difference in the quarterly report and long-term sustainability. There's a difference in making a profit this quarter and being around in 10 or 15 or 20 years. And that has to do with quality of our communities, quality of life, education systems, social safety nets, those kinds of things that make a community viable and sustainable, that frankly, the market, because they're not captured in market transactions, is going to underproduce. I mean, as I say, markets do a lot of wonderful things, but they're going to underproduce those things. Who
would you name in the state? I'm talking only about positive elected leaders now. Are there positive electeds or positive heads either in business or in government, in organizations, chambers of commerce. Can you, I appreciate knowing about HEB and Paul Yetter, and we sure, you're right. We did have a great presentation on what they are still doing now. But in terms of, you can tell I'm rather into action.
Yes.
What can we do?
Well, there's been a lot of folks that have stepped up recently. On your side of the aisle, if you like, my two longtime friends, Rodney Ellis and Royce West, have both done great work over the years on many things. Commissioner Ellis, former Senator Ellis, worked with the Innocence Project and many other things. Is quite good. Royce has been a stout voice for education forever. Jessica Gonzalez really stood up and tried to do something on the LGBTQ issues in the legislature this time. There's been a number of folks who stand up. To give you one on the other side of the aisle, former Speaker Joe Strauss has tried to come up with some good comments, and he's from a family that has a long, deep Republican roots and long, deep conservative heritage. I've known the family for generations. His mom is a very, very dear friend of mine, but he has spoken out on some common sense, practical things involving things like voting legislation, discrimination legislation, things like that. And so, I mean, those are some of the leaders in Texas who have, in both parties, who have spoken out and done some things that are that I think are very worthwhile in trying to promote things and move things forward. If I went further back into history, some of the folks who are no longer with us, I could give you a long list, but that's probably not productive at this point. In the interest of keeping things going, if I can, can I switch over to
I'm sorry to
immigration now?
interrupt. Please keep going.
All right, sure. And if you need to interrupt me, please do. I mean, you can tell.
I'm not shy.
I'm not reading a set of notes. You can tell that my hands.
I get it.
So, but as I mentioned with immigration, let me focus for just a minute. I talked about immigration in general and skilled workforce. Let me talk about that unskilled workforce that gets so much adverse publicity these days, the undocumented workers. Most of the myths about them are just that, myths. They're not bringing 20 kids over here with them. On average, there's 4 workers for every 1 non-worker among that group. They ebb and flow with the market, but we force the employers and the employees to go through, really, particularly the employees, inhuman things to be a part of our labor market. And the reason they're here is the market looked around and said, we don't have enough workers, where can we get some? And they are 10% of the Texas workforce. I mean, literally, 1 out of every 10 workers in Texas today is undocumented. 40% of our hospitality workforce, 40% of our agriculture workforce, and 30% of our construction workforce. So as long as you don't want to build anything, grow anything, or go anywhere, I guess we're okay. But if any of those things appeal to you, we need that group of workers. And again, that's really, and they bring in more revenue to the federal government, the state government, and in the aggregate local governments, not every single local government, in the aggregate local governments, than any costs that are endured by those. I was the expert for MALDEF, and we opposed the Attorney General and managed to get that some of the work of that done with the DACA kids, for example. But the point being that we need sensible immigration legislation that lets us make use of that workforce efficiently and properly and with some human dignity associated with it. And those are the kinds of policies we need to get. And a lot of these myths that are out there, and these notions that are out there, that everyone who's unemployed is lazy, or everyone who's ever had a food stamp is lazy, or whatever the case may be, that we've got to get past all of that and move forward. And I think that's a real challenge. And also, I'm going to talk about this when I talk about voting rights. The other piece is the people who moved to Texas from other states. And we've done a very good job over the years. I mean, there's hardly a week goes by that we're not seeing some story about some other California company moving to Texas. That seems to be what everybody wants to write about these days. And there are quite a few of them. But we have always, again, since we were a republic, we've always brought people in from the outside to support the economic growth of Texas. And that's becoming increasingly more difficult. And I'm going to delve into more of that when I get into the voting side of things in a moment. But that's going to become increasingly more difficult with the recent spate of legislation that we've passed in terms of gender rights, reproductive rights, voting rights, and many other things. That's making it more difficult, and I'll be able to quantify a little bit of that for you as we go in that direction.
Is that data in some of your reports, especially on how it's a disincentive for companies to move here when we deprive their workers of their rights?
Absolutely. If you go to our website, all these are available free on our website, perrymangroup.com. We have studies on the gender inequality issue. We have studies on voter issues. We have, and I think some of the promotional materials, some of those numbers were cited. We have studies on indigent healthcare. We have studies on discrimination in the workforce. If there's any number of studies out there that we have tackled some of these issues, more to come, but they're all out there on the website. You can go download them at your leisure, and they're again, we don't charge anything for them. They're just out there. Some of them had sponsorship, some of them were done, most of them were done pro bono, but we have a substantial number of those out there. So that gets to the whole issue of more Texans. Yes, we're going to need more Texans in the future. Demographically, we're blessed with the opportunity to have more Texans in the future, but that can very quickly become a liability rather than an asset for the business case if we don't educate them, treat them properly, and create the kind of environment that makes the folks want to come to Texas.
And is that perrymangroup.com? Is that the website you're talking about?
Yeah, just perrymangroup.com. That's right.
Thank you, Steve.
And as I say, that's very simple. Yeah, I just see somebody just put it in the chat. Thanks, Steve, for doing that. Yeah, and again, there's a lot of stuff out there. Feel free to pull down any of it you want to at any time. And I hesitate to say this, but the email address on the website is info@perryman.com. If you change info to Ray, it'll come directly to me. I hate to say that, but
Thank you.
but I will. Okay. In terms of the voting, because it does
Right.
into all of this. We took a deep dive, and with some of the part of this was pro bono, part of it was sponsored by the Texas Civil Rights Project, and we did a deep dive into the economic impact of the voting restrictions that are taking place right now. And again, in my opinion, we should want everybody to have access to the ballot, and both parties should be out there trying to put forth policies that make themselves attractive to large numbers of people because they meet their needs and provide the things government should provide. But obviously it's not always seen that way. But regardless of all that, we try to do a deep dive and just focus on the economics of it. And again, I don't want to read you a bunch of numbers, but let me kind of give you the big picture of what we did, because there's two big pieces, two big buckets, and they both tie back to what I was saying earlier in terms of education, immigration, and that sort of thing. And I'm going to try to tie all that together for you as well. With regard to the two buckets, for lack of a better name, I call them internal and external. That is the harms that come as a result of things that go on inside of Texas because we passed these laws, and the things that go on outside of Texas because we passed these laws that impact Texas directly. Inside, a very important one is that it's been shown by many, many academic studies, and we're able to take all that data, all those models, localize them, bring them down to the specific structure of Texas, the specific structure of our bills and that sort of thing, and look at people who have access to voting rights have higher earnings than people who don't. And there are a number of reasons for that. Obviously, if you have an advocacy, you're able to lobby for more funds for your school system, for your transportation system, for your infrastructure, for your social needs, those kinds of things. And because the earnings are lower, therefore the consumer spending that flows to the economy is lower. And so that's the first piece. That's the internal piece. We took all of that together and ran it through the models and found it cost Texas by 2025 about $14 billion a year passing this legislation, 14.7, I think, something like that. Again, all the numbers are in the study. The external bucket comes from two sources. First of all is the tourism industry of Texas, which is obviously was hit very hard by the pandemic, is trying to come back. You all saw in very high profile way when North Carolina passed their so-called bathroom bill, NCAA pulled a bunch of events out. When Georgia passed their voting rights law, the Major League All-Star game left. Those kinds of things matter. And the other thing that happens is as corporations move more to the environmental and social governance platform, the corporations that sponsor major conventions and that sort of thing simply don't want to be identified with areas that have these kinds of policies in place. And so they don't want to sponsor things in those areas. And some tourists as well just simply don't want to travel to those areas. There's been a lot of surveys done of all that. We were able to take some of that bring it down to number one, you guys are familiar with surveys. I mean, those are in the political world, constantly see a poll that says, you know, it gives you a percentage that says plus or minus 3% margin of error. What that means is there's a 95% confidence interval. It says there's a 95% chance to answer between this number minus 3% and this number plus 3%. We took that out to 99% confidence bounds to say there's a 99% chance between here and here, and we took the lowest number. And so we did this to make sure we were being conservative and understating, because we knew, and quite correctly, that these studies would face some challenges and some criticism, and that's fine. That's part of what happens. And but we did that, and we focused only on the tourists who identified themselves as being socially conscious. And we did a lot of things to get the numbers down. And the other piece of the external, and this is one that's really important, ties back to a lot of what I've said before. 86% of the knowledge workers in the United States do not want to locate in a state that has these types of policies.
86%?
86%, yes, ma'am. 86% of the knowledge workers. The single biggest asset for every major tech company in the world is its workforce. And again, that's not to say there aren't other things that cause them to come here. We've had some success bringing them here in Texas, obviously. But as the workforce becomes more important, and then we're going to know that happens because, again, the demographics I talked about above are going to give us a worker shortage for decades in this country. That's a demographic fact. And without some immigration reform that lets us bring more people in, it's going to be even more critical. But with all of that happening, you know, the workforce is going to become increasingly important in terms of where these locations take place. And again, there'll be some remote work that takes place, but they don't even want to be associated with companies that are headquartered in some of those places. So that's a problem. Yes, Barbara.
Okay. Where can we find the 86% number on your website and marshal it for whatever uses we want to make? Where do we find that?
It's in the voting rights study that's on the website, and it's footnoted.
Okay, it's in a footnote in the voting rights study.
That's correct. That's correct.
Okay.
You probably have to go beyond the executive summary to get to that
And
one. But
I know you've got more to ask and there's more questions, but finish it up by answering one of the earlier questions I saw in the chat, which is, what about the impact of remote workers? And the questioner there had analyzed it in the chat and said, looks like maybe we don't have to worry that companies will completely outsource outside of Texas their work, and remote work may not be the default for the future. But what's the impact?
Yeah, again, there's going to be more than there was in the past. There's going to be more remote work than there was in the past. But as I said earlier, we've already gone from 35% of the workforce to 13% that's working remotely. I mean, we had to do it during the pandemic. That put them on steroids. These workers do have some flexibility, but you talk about what business wants. 96% of the Fortune 500, when they did the survey, their CEO said, we want our workers back at work. You know, we want the, you know, as we all know, this would be a better conversation if we were in the same room or sitting around a table. All these people are typing something in chat, would be raising their hand or getting my attention or coming up afterwards and talking to me and all those things. It would be better if we were all in the same room. I like it better. Frankly, in most of my speeches, I didn't take time today. I've tried to tell a few jokes. I like to know if anybody's laughing or not.
There's another good chat question, one more, and it is,
Sure.
Is that both skilled and unskilled workers? That we really like your 86% number.
I know you do. Well, the 86%,
and it's conservative.
Yeah, the 86% was knowledge workers. So those are skilled
knowledge workers.
Yes, right.
What about the unskilled workers?
Well, the unskilled workers, again, we face a real challenge there. And that's what I was trying to talk about, why the undocumented workforce is so important to us. A lot of those are unskilled workers. And to realistically think we could suddenly get rid of 10% of our workforce tomorrow in construction, and 30% of construction, 40% of agriculture, 40% of hospitality, I don't think so. You know, I mean, the solution is to find a way to get them here in this way. Every category of worker is going to be critical. That's why I said when I started the immigration thing, yes, everybody talks about the undocumented. 25% of our workforce wasn't born in the United States, okay, in Texas. That includes doctors, it includes engineers, it includes, scientists. We need, and it includes the folks who clean the hotels and pick the crops. I mean, it includes all of these people. And it's very, very critical that people recognize that this is a fundamental part of market solve problems. And one of the ways the market solved the problem of we don't have enough workers is it went overseas and found some. And now all of a sudden that's a bad thing. And I don't understand why. And we really need some serious reform on that. And again, particularly on the undocumented side, to make these folks documented and let them come over here legally and not in the back of trucks where they suffocate and things like that. I mean, we can and avoid all that human tragedy. Again, if I can just, I'll try to wrap up in 2 or 3 minutes and then take whatever questions you want me to take. To try to pull all this together in a meaningful way. The internal part of what I talked about with voting rights, the earnings impacts, education is such a key part of that, and the public infrastructure is such a key part of that. I talked earlier about the other side of the equation, the immigration, the bringing in people from the outside to live and work in Texas. The external piece of it that I just mentioned in terms of that is critical there. And those I don't think I said all the numbers, but those they're all in the report, and I think some of them are even in the headlines to your promo you set out. But the bottom line is, as Barbara mentioned at the beginning, a number of years ago, I started working on some of the humanitarian issues, poverty, hunger, child maltreatment, indigent healthcare, those kinds of things in a big way, with the goal being to get people to do the right thing for the wrong reason. I'll say that straight up. And I've worked very extensively with Feeding America, with Prevent Child Abuse America. I've worked all over the country trying to get these things done. But one thing I've learned is, and I think this is the lesson I would like to leave with you today in terms of Barbara asked me to try to kind of pull all this together in some way when we were chatting earlier this week. Poverty, what I've discovered through all this work, and by the way, I have many unfinished symphonies in my life, and one of them is I'm doing a massive study to measure the total consequences of poverty in the United States today. And I've got a long way to go with it because I can only do it in my spare time and I don't have a lot. But the one thing I have learned from that I think is critical is from my math head, I will say poverty is a simultaneous equation problem. That is, you can't just fix the education, you can't just fix the housing, you can't just fix the transportation, you can't just fix the safety net and the hunger. You've got, if you're not addressing all of them, they feed on themselves. There's loops back and forth. If you were to, and we've seen this in some of our historical programs, if you were to give everybody decent housing, but you didn't take care of their education needs, their hunger needs and that sort of thing, the housing will deteriorate. In other words, it's a simultaneous equation and you have to address them all at once. That's really a tough thing to do with policy because most policies are focused in one direction or another. The one policy that helped with all of this at one time is to give people access to the ballot. Because when people can vote, they have a voice in how the public sector operates. They have a voice in where the money gets allocated and how it gets allocated. And if the group that are disadvantaged right now could truly swing elections, and everybody knew they can swing elections, and demographically they certainly, if they have access to the ballot, have the ability to swing elections, they would be in a position to massively influence public policy. Today, they are basically, for lack of a better name, outbid in a lot of public policy arenas right now. But the one thing they have is if we allow them to have it, is a vote. And if enough of them vote for the things that they really need in their lives, that's the one policy that will help us deal with hunger, it will help us deal with child maltreatment, it will help us deal with the infrastructure issues in low-income areas, it will help us deal with all the issues that surround poverty and all the issues that surround rights, whether it's reproductive rights or gender equality rights or voting rights. Access to the ballot is the key to all of that. And so if there's one policy, and that's why I was asked to talk about Texans and Texas voters, we have a lot of policies, a lot of work we need to do. The single most important thing we can do today just to really make a dent in all of these simultaneous equation problems at once is give people access to the ballot. With that, I will stop and I will turn it over to any other questions or comments or anything else. And I don't know how long I have. It's 1:01, so I knew I'd run up to the edge, but I'm happy to stay a few more minutes or whatever you'd like to do.
That's fine, Dr. Perryman. We're going to go about 5 minutes over today because we have a lot of interest and we've got over 160 people across the state tuning in. We will also offer this recording later. It will be posted on our Facebook page. I know Nicholas had a question, and then I'll go back to Barbara. She probably will have another after that.
I'm shocked.
Good afternoon, Dr. Perryman. So you kind of alluded to this a little bit, but I wanted to ask you specifically, We did see a lot of press coverage anyway about the success of those initiatives in North Carolina and Georgia, where companies were coming out in favor or opposing particular policies. Is that a possible solution for the education policy here? Like if there was some sort of corporate initiative that where we ask large companies to publicly support public education, and that public support includes the following points. Could that model be used to get those corporate, citizens on to behave a little bit better with respect to their, let's say, policy dollars in the education realm?
Well, I can't claim to be a politician, but I can tell you from some of my experiences I've had, yes, that would help a lot. And the business community actually has less influence today than it did at one point in time because of kind of the direction a lot of things have gone that frankly have made the other party kind of anti-business. But I will tell you, for example, when we killed the bathroom bill, so to speak, here in Texas a few years back, I personally went around to legislators' offices for 2 days with the heads of most of the major tech companies that do business in Texas and met with those folks and explained to them why it shouldn't happen. And that played a major role, along with some very good leadership from folks in both parties, some very good leadership along the way to take care of that. But yes, the fact that, you know, the CEOs of some of these largest tech companies that made multi-billion-dollar investments in Texas were sitting in the offices of members of the Texas House and Senate, that did have an impact. So I would say anytime you can engage and energize the business community to getting engaged in an important issue like this, we should. And I give, I don't know, 100 speeches a year, and I can't imagine any other than I would give these days where I don't tell everybody in the room the single most important thing we have to do is educate these kids. And so, you know, I mean, that message is it's getting out there, not solely from me, but from a lot of sources. And I think that would be one that would be easier than maybe some others to get people behind. I mean, and so I think that if you can coalesce that corporate group together in an organized way, and particularly if you put some money behind it and their voices, then that's very important. Again, as you know, there's a lot of, and this has been around forever, it seems more intense now, a lot of retribution and that sort of thing that takes place in the political world, and people have been more reluctant, but I think education might be an issue they could more easily get behind.
Barbara, you have any final questions?
Well, I have a comment and would be interested in your response, but it doesn't require one.
Okay.
It seems to me it's time. It's time for some sort of corporate responsibility, some sort of business responsibility. And I question whether one man nowadays could have the ability, even a Ray Perryman, to get enough heads of corporations together to walk them to certain politicians' offices and make a difference. Because if you could, you would, and I know you. And so I wonder if it's not time for more greater pressure on businesses to say, you cannot stand idly by and watch what's happening in Texas, or for that matter, what's happening nationally.
Well, obviously, I mean, Ray Perryman's not the person who can do that. I'll tell you that right away. And as you say, I think it would take a group coalescing. Let me mention one thing that might be a useful data point here. Shortly before the pandemic started, the Business Roundtable, which is the CEOs of the largest 185 or so companies in America, all the names you see on the news all the time associated with big business are in this. They all adopted the so-called ESG model, the environmental and social governance. And in essence, what that says is, yeah, we still care about profits. We still care about maximizing profits, but we don't care about maximizing profits this quarter. We care about being around for the next 10 or 20 years. And it's a more enlightened approach that says we have to have liberal communities, we have to have good schools, we have to have good workers, we have to take care of people to make that happen. That has gotten to the point now that most corporations report on that to their shareholders, and the SEC even monitors it. The Securities and Exchange Commission even monitors their ESG efforts. Now, part of the problem with that is you don't want to turn it into a structure where it's a box they can check. You know, you want it to be more organic and be able to respond to issues. But there's a big movement in corporate America right now to move in this direction that, with a lot of leadership from a lot of people, I think, to be marshaled and channeled in those directions. There, as you can not surprisingly, there are consulting firms out there that help them do this now. And I'm not sure that's the best way to handle it, but it is becoming more part of the corporate language. Yes, ma'am.
But where were those guys, and maybe there were women too, but where were those guys when the last special session was happening, or the second to last special session was happening? Where were they? How did it happen?
Yeah, I mean, it's very, very difficult. And frankly, as I said earlier, there's those political pressures, the retribution, that sort of thing that sometimes gets in the way. And we have seen a lot of that. We've seen, I remember vividly that we had a situation where we had a Medicaid, and I'm sure some of you are aware of it, some of you are probably involved in it. I've been trying to get Medicaid expansion done here ever since the Supreme Court said the states had an option. And I've done, I think, 7 or 8 studies on it, and I've helped 12 other states get it, but I can't get my home state around. But literally in the last session, we had a bill that had 76 people signed on to it to do a version. It's not the perfect version, but a version of Medicaid expansion. And within a day or two, with the pressure that came to bear from other interests, that went away. And at the end of the day, there was only one Republican who actually would stand up both those things. He's not seeking re-election. And so it's a very difficult environment. Now I cherish the days. I try not to be political, I swear. But I remember, because I've spoken to political groups all my life, and I remember when I used to speak to the Texas delegation, for example, they'd all wander in, 30 years ago and sit in different places and talk to each other and that sort of thing. And now I talk to them, and Democrats sit on one side of the room, Republicans sit on the other side of the room, and they don't talk to each other. We've got to get back to, and it's difficult because of the primary system. It's difficult because of Citizens United, the money and how it drives the primary system. Every vote is viewed, there are people who have a litmus test of whether or not to get primaried on every vote. And that's not the best way to get things done. If you look back on historic legislation that, for example, that Lyndon Johnson was able to pass, a lot of that happened because he drank scotch with Edward Dirksen, who was the staunch conservative of the day, and they worked things out. And I really, I think the only way that happens is the voters have to demand it. And one way to make that happen is get more people access to the ballot. And I know that's the challenge we're facing right now. Again, I think that both parties should be rather than trying to keep people from voting, which one party seems to be doing right now, should both be trying to come up with the kinds of policies and ideas that make all of us better off. Because I can tell you very good ideas that have come out of both parties over the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years of my career and the centuries I've studied it before that. But it's very frustrating right now, and it's very difficult to marshal those forces in the way that we need to, Barbara, for the very reason you said. I mean, it's the retribution immediately becomes there, because as soon as people start doing that, another group comes in and says, if you make this vote, we're going to primary you, whatever the case may be. And a lot of that's going on right now, which is really unfortunate. Frankly, in your party, I hate to see what's going on in DC right now, where they can't get 50 folks together to do some pretty basic things. Those are the kinds of things that used to, you figure out ways to make it happen. I think, as much as some people decry it, I think getting rid of pork probably made that worse, because nobody has anything to trade with today. And democracy's always been, as George Will once said, the politics of the half loaf. It's always been trying to put ideas together and come up with something that works. And we've made it very difficult, more difficult for that to happen. I think the combination of the primary systems, the redistricting, the polarization, and the unlimited source of funds that are in politics now have made that very, very difficult. I know, in my own experience, there was a point in time when, at least when I testified, everybody would listen to me. Half of them wouldn't believe it, but at least they'll listen to me. Now some of them won't even listen to me.
Well, Dr. Perryman, a lot of people are listening to you today, and we're getting lots of great comments, but we're going to have to wrap it up. But tell you what, when we can go back to having in-person things, we really like you to come to Houston and give a live presentation. Perhaps.
I would love to do so. And I appreciate all the work all of you are doing to try to make our state and our country a better place. It's very, very, very important to all of us. I have a bunch of kids and a bunch of grandkids that have to keep going in this world. And I look forward to, in fact, if I can have just a very quick second, I understand that my oldest daughter is on the call today. She was texting me a minute beforehand, so I assume she is. And she is the head of Democracy Forward, a large organization in DC that's been litigating to help deal with some of these issues very effectively. It was started by John Podesta and Mark Elias, and I think Ron Klain was in the original founding group, and she is the CEO of that now, and is doing some remarkable and very good work there. And there's other organizations like that are out there trying to make good things happen, and that gives me a lot of hope and encouragement about the future.
What's your daughter's name that's executive director of
Sky Perryman. I
Okay.
think it's, I should know the email. I think it's Sky Perryman at democracyforward.com, but you can go to their website. But they're she's done a lot of wonderful work there, and that has really had an impact. She's worked very closely with a number of folks here in Texas. She was in fact, it was her group that was really promoting behind the scenes the lawsuits over the walkout and that sort of thing, and the suspension of pay and all of that. I know she's worked with Donna Howard on some of the, she previously was the general counsel for the College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, worked on a lot of those reproductive rights issues with Donna Howard and some other good folks that you will all know. And anyway, there's a lot of organizations doing a lot of good work out there.
Well, thank you, Dr. Perryman. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you, Dana Hansen with Blue Action Democrats. Let's get behind organizations like Lena's and here in Harris County and all over Texas, and let's get the vote out, help people get to vote. Despite all the measures our state has taken to make it more difficult, let's make sure we increase turnout significantly this time for Democrats, and let's make sure we get Democrats elected. People are really trying to solve problems. Thank you for everybody, and we'll see you next time. Hopefully the first Thursday in February will be our next event. There'll be news to follow. It'll be posted on our Facebook page and our website. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.